Our next or final item today is revisiting the George Floyd Square concept layout, which was continued from last meeting. And first we have an update from staff on community engagement and survey results. And here to present, I see Jen Swanson from Public Works.
Chair Cashman, it's going to be Nathan Koster who will be presenting today.
Great. Welcome, Nathan.
Committee. My name is Nathan Koster, Supervisor, Transportation Planner in Public Works, Transportation Planning and Programming Division. I'm here today to present a receive and file item for an update on the community engagement and survey results for the 38th and Chicago George Floyd Square project. Today I'll be covering a little bit of the background of the work and the legislative history, as well as a review of the concept layout work to date to ground people of where we've been at, and provide an update on the PEDMAL survey that Public Works developed. Just a reminder of where we've come from. Public Works has been leading the 38th in Chicago Re-Envision project, which is a reconstruction of the streets of both 38th from Park to 10th and Chicago Avenue from 37th to 39th Street. This has been nested within the broader enterprise work with the Visioning and Priorities project that took place in 2024, but was predated by years of engagement with the community specific to the Re-Envision project. We wanted to provide a recent legislative history of this work just to ground both the committee, staff, as well as community members, because there's been a lot of actions on this and a lot of movement in the last few months. So looking back to November, on the 12th, the city, both the Office of Public Service and all of the divisions, departments working on this work provided an update on the Vision and Priority report. Public Works then brought forward a recommendation for the concept layout for the streets, which included the concept layout approval and easements. That was forwarded to full City Council on December 5th without recommendation. At full council approved a resolution related to the pedestrian plaza, racial justice, and economic development, and referred the concept layout back to the Climate Infrastructure Committee scheduled for January 9th. I'm now realizing there's a typo because it is 2025. I feel like we get a freebie for the first month here, but on January 9th, we did postpone that action. And we're coming back here today to provide an update on that community engagement and survey results. To provide a grounding, just a little bit of history of talking about the concept layouts, we want to provide a slide specific to the items that we've been talking about a lot. I'm going to be referencing the 3700 block of Chicago Ave a number of times in the presentation, and I'll clarify the 3700 block is from East 37th Street to East 38th Street along Chicago Avenue. In November, Public Works made the recommendation for the flexible open, and there was considerable conversation as well for the pedestrian plaza. One thing that we thought would be helpful clarifying is what a concept layout represents. The concept layout represents a basic two-dimensional drawing that shows the uses and allocations of space of the street design. We do preliminary reviews from an engineering perspective to understand operational maintenance needs for the street, but these do not reflect final engineering. They're primarily two-dimensional drawings, so we can communicate what the community can expect when we're bringing forward these layouts for approval. So we wanted to clarify some of the details of the flexible open that was recommended. The flexible open concept would allow for full vehicular and transit access to return to the block, but really focusing on making sure this could be a space that does allow for regular, frequent closures and working directly with the community to define those and set those up. Now, the reason why I put the pedestrian plaza concept layout adjacent to that is you can really see the rest of the design, almost all of it, save for the last 100 feet between the alley adjacent to the 3744 People's Way property that the city owns, and the intersection, that's the primary difference. And then calling out in the third graphic to the right, where we're at from a preliminary concept layout perspective. We're really highlighting that box in red that shows there is a fair amount of flexibility if we have a recommendation to go forward in final engineering to really adjust what those limits would be. And that would be really specific to what's called the raised intersection. The raised intersection would be at level with the sidewalk. And until we get into final engineering, we haven't determined what the limits could be. In actuality, the limits of that raised intersection could look very close and very similar to the extents of the pedestrian plaza, but that would allow for continued flexibility and allowing for, at a future time, if that pedestrian plaza wants to be established, and it would not preclude that option in the future. Similarly, we showed potential gate locations. Those have not been finalized, and as I've shared previously in our presentations, those are something we'd want to work very closely with the community on identifying both what those could look like, but the location and operations. One additional item, just clarifying, is much like all of our other projects, when we look at concept layouts, we're looking at operations, maintenance, and feasibility, and we're always working with our emergency response team, including the fire department. If and when we advance a design, we want to continue to look at how these spaces can be accommodating and serving those vehicles. This was brought up similarly in the last presentation with our boulevard ordinance that we discussed. Similarly there to here is making sure we're working with those partners in the city enterprise to make sure that we're designing spaces that allow for access, whether it's for fire or emergencies, through that space. So previously to other presentations I've shared on this topic is really reinforcing the idea of creating these flexible spaces so they can be accommodating to regular, recurring closures to allow for the larger events and gatherings that would support the approved concept layout that was to move forward. These are just a few representative examples that we have, some locally, whether it's here in Minneapolis, or throughout the country, or even internationally. These are just ideas, and ideas that we would be very excited to work with community, council, what have you, to try to make this a reality. So since we last met in December, Public Works had worked to proactively develop a preliminary survey to start gauging interest in a ped mall. And we did this proactively, understanding the existing parameters of the state statute as it relates to the ped mall. This was a very proactive step to start to understand any potential protests from abutting property owners if a ped mall was to be advanced. So the process that we took on this 3700 block for all property owners between 37th and 38th was to start identifying a list of the property owners, identify emails, phone numbers, any forms of contact. That even required going out and individually door knocking, word of mouth, how to get a hold of everyone. We tried to take as thorough a process as we could and started with making sure we had one-on-one conversations, not only to share the update of where the project is at and where we've been at through a legislative history in the last few months, but also provide that opportunity to have another round of input so they understand where everything's at and if there's other perspectives that they'd like to share about things that they like, they don't like, that we had that one-on-one conversation before just sending out a letter. And that was our priority, to make sure we had good, open forms of communication with our stakeholders along this block. As a part of the survey, we developed two options. Option A was the cul-de-sac, which represents the pedestrian plaza that had been discussed. And because we were going to all the effort of engaging and making sure we were talking with everyone, we wanted to have our bases covered in the event that the desire changed along that block, and adding a second option, option B, which would include a full closure, 37th to 38th along that block. This had been something that had been discussed during community engagement, And since we're going to all the work to connect with all the property owners, we thought it would be in our best interest just to have all of our bases covered. So the survey overview and results. As I said, this focused on the 3700 block of Chicago Avenue. On this block, there are a total of 22 properties, 20 which are privately owned and 2 of which are city-owned. City owns the 3700 property, which is a public works property related to the stormwater pond, the Say Their Name Cemetery, as it's referred to the community, and the 3744 property that we've been discussing a lot, which is the CPED-owned property, People's Way site that is in an active request for qualifications, the RFQ, with community to define a community-centered owner. Staff reached out to all non-city properties to conduct this survey on both of the options. So far, we've been able to contact all but one of the private properties. There's one single-family residential property that's been a little bit difficult to get a hold of, but we have done door knocking. But of the 20, we were able to get responses from 15 of the 20. Of the remaining 5, it's actually 4 different property owners because one owner has 2 adjacent lots. So we have been able to make substantial progress on that outreach, given that the survey was developed and started to be deployed at the end of the year between holiday seasons. But between establishing good relationships and being very diligent in communication, we feel like we were able to make really good progress on that in the short amount of time to come back to this body and be accountable and responsive to some of the questions that were passed. To date, on the responses on option A, the cul-de-sac, 100% of the non-city properties near the cul-de-sac would not support. And option B, the full, 100% of all the non-city properties would not support. And we've done this through a lot of one-on-one conversations. As I said, the priority was have sit-down conversations and have an open conversation and be able to talk more about the project, their feedback, and really anything that they had to discuss with the project and really build those relationships. Of that, all of those were in person except for 2. We had 1 virtual meeting and 1 meeting by phone call. Just it's been a lot to juggle everyone's schedules through the holidays. So today, I wanted to make sure we could share that and be able to stand by for any questions. This is the last slide I had prepared and the information that we had today. So that concludes my portion of the presentation, and I'd be happy to stand by for any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Nathan, for the presentation. I will, wait for others to get into speaker management into the queue, but I did have a couple questions for you. So first of all, as you were presenting in, was it November last year, the 3 options that you looked at, the PED Mall, the PED Plaza, the Transit Mall, and then the open concept. As you were doing the pedestrian plaza concept, did you do this type of survey last year?
Chair, we did not do this specific type of survey.
Okay, and as we've been working with the city attorneys and looking into the state statute around developing a pedestrian mall ordinance, we've learned that certain legal findings need to be made, including, access for alternative routes for private vehicles and access for emergency vehicles and other things. Last year, did you make any efforts to establish those findings that are necessary for compliance with the state statute?
Chair Cashman, members of the committee, while we did not make a specific report that would establish an ordinance as laid out by the state statute, a number of these things are regular elements as we do project development, as you've said, reasonable, suitable access. I've already mentioned we've done multiple rounds of engagement with the fire department like we do on all projects. So many of these findings were questions and technical items that we did advance as staff, but we did not make a specific report as prescriptively laid out in the state statute. But many of these tasks, as I've said, are things that we do with every project we bring forward to make sure that we're bringing forward feasible projects that can be owned, operated, maintained, and serve the public.
Okay, so the legal findings for state statute and ped mal ordinances are largely done and compliant.
Chair Cashman, we have not completed a specific findings report, and that's what I want to take away. Individually, these are tasks that we do complete as a part of project, but we did not prescriptively make a findings report as laid out in the items 1 through 6 that I believe you're referring to in the state statute. So I don't want to conflate the two questions.
Yeah.
Those are tasks we did complete, but not specific to what is laid out that would be ready to present to council
Okay.
today.
Got it. And then, so I know last year you said that as you were developing those 3 concepts that you had deemed the ped plaza option to be not feasible. I'm not sure if that's the word that you used, but can you describe, like, without having done the outreach of property owners, how you deemed it not feasible last year?
Chair Cashman, I do appreciate that you're asking questions about the wording. We did not use the word not feasible, is if we think back to the vision and priorities report, we had a number of community priorities that we tied together for the arts memorials, the People's Way site, and the street to have a cohesive vision that reflected a lot of the priorities that the community wanted to see. And I believe there's 6 street-specific design priorities that we took into account. And as we advance all projects, regardless of where they are, the types of projects, we're looking at what are the goals of the project, what do our plans and policies say, and then how are we doing the technical and legal work. And we're balancing all of those things. Internally, we call that like the 3-legged stool of how we're advancing work. So when we presented those, we are identifying what are the pros and cons, what is the community telling us, and how do we weigh that and then be able to transparently point to each one of those items to say, here's like what works or doesn't work. We had never come back and reported 100% this is not feasible, but given all the work we presented to date, that is where we felt confident in making that recommendation and bring it forward for the city council to consider.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the additional community surveying that you've done here in the last few weeks. And I think this will be my last question, is on this design. If you can go one slide back, there is just south of there a planned BRT station. And can you explain to me, for pedestrian mall closure, how the buses would navigate around the Fist here? Because I'm feeling a little concerned about the ability for a BRT bus to even get through this intersection.
Chair Cashman, that's a really good question. And one thing I want to clarify is we have been working very closely with our partners at Metro Transit, and the D-line had been long planned for years, lining up state funding and federal funding for that project. When George Floyd was murdered, we took a hard pause with Metro Transit, and they have been our partners throughout that, and identifying if, how, or when transit would return. Transit on Chicago Avenue, both the Route 5 and now the operating D-line, operate on detour. So northbound buses go to 39th and go over to Park and around. Similarly, southbound avoids the area. So while it was planned, all of that was put on pause and would align with this process, and whatever the outcomes of this process was, we have very supportive and collaborative partners that would align with us. So that is the history. As it relates to transit service would return under the flexible open option, both the Route 5 local service and the D-line. And one of the key aspects of that is fully understanding the traffic circle and all the arts and memorials is imperative and one of the biggest priorities of the project. And we started from a place of, if the buses couldn't get through without compromising those community assets, that would not be something we'd advance. Looking at the turning movements and all of the preliminary engineering, as I was referring to in the concept layout, we got to a place that we could incorporate the traffic circle and 2 stations to the south of the intersection that would not impact existing community art memorials or gathering spaces, that it could get through the intersection. And that is something we ran through many iterations, working with our partners in engineering design, traffic, and Metro Transit to look specifically at the types of buses, the turning movements, and winter conditions to make sure this was successful and that we felt confident that it could return. And to really like clarify the point, is like that is something that we feel confident that was vetted that would work under the flexible open option. And that does represent a change from where it was at prior to the murder of George Floyd, where the BRT was on the 3700 block. That under this condition would be moved away from that into the south of the intersection.
Okay, thanks for answering that question for me. And next I'll recognize Councilmember Vita.
Thank you, Chair Cashman. Thank you, Mr. Coster, for this presentation. I really haven't said much about this. You know, the last presentation you did, there was a bit of controversy in the decisions that were made, and I think that sparked so many people from this area reaching out to my office. I had never had a lot of engagement with residents in the area about what they wanted to see or how they wanted to see it, and even people in my ward, because this part of the city, everyone feels like it's their part of the city. So I've had a lot of engagement with people from Ward 4 and also South Minneapolis residents since the last presentation, and you kind of showing us these possible layouts or what could happen there. And I think you've done a fantastic job. I think staff has done a wonderful job at presenting some progress and some ways that we can really spotlight such a bad place and make it better for residents. Like you were just talking about the transit system coming through. There's so many people reached out and said, I'd love to have that service back here in this area. This is how I get to work. This is how I get my kids to school. This is how, you know, I get to the grocery store. So I'm looking forward to us making some progress on this. It's been 4 years, and, you know, this neighborhood has really had to adjust to some different ways of getting around. And I think you all have put together a package that can help and also memorialize what we're trying to accomplish here in the name of George Floyd. And I'm just really proud of the work that staff has done. I'm really proud of the community engagement. I mean, to have a project where 70% of participants are saying that they want something, that's a huge deal. Like I've done work in trying to collect surveys and trying to get people, you know, to answer a survey, or I've door knocked. I've done all the things that you've mentioned that staff have done, and that's just a lot of work. That's a lot of work, and it shows the commitment. It shows that you all really want the community to be engaged. I hope you and others like Mr. Cato are proud of the work that you're doing. I know it's really hard and complicated, and it doesn't always feel good, but sometimes the hard stuff comes with so much pain. I mean, I wish I could do something to make it better, because it is hard when you know you're doing your best and you're still, you know, facing brick walls all the time and knowing you're doing your best. I just didn't want to miss another opportunity to tell you how grateful I am for the work that you and staff have been doing to move this along and make this better and engage community and involve the people who live in this neighborhood, because it is important. It's super important that they have a voice, and I don't think we're ever going to make everyone happy on this, but I do think people want to see some progress in this, and I think that's a citywide thing. It's not limited to the people who live in that area. I think people really want to see progress. It's time that we make progress, and I, you know, it is. Just thank you for sticking with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, I'll recognize Councilmember Osman.
Thank you for that presentation. My question is the 15 properties you mentioned, are those like residential, commercial? What is the mix of those properties?
Chair Cashman, Councilmember Osman. As I mentioned, there's 20 private properties, excluding the 2 city properties. There's 2 that are residential. One is a duplex, and we met with the owner of the duplex and the property manager. The other one, as I mentioned, the one that's been difficult to get a hold of, is this one single-family residential. that we have door knocked and tried to get a hold of. So that is really the mix of uses on the block, 2 primarily residential, while the rest are mixes of commercial properties.
Okay, thank you. And then the survey, was it verbal, or is it just writing option A and B, select which one you like? Was it similar to that, or just the interview? How was that survey taken?
Councilmember Cashman, or Chair Cashman, Councilmember Osmond, that's a great question, and we want to be really thoughtful and intentional. We do surveys a lot in the city. You get a link, you get something in the mail, it goes right away. The reason why it was so time intensive is we wanted to make sure that people understood what the project is, because some people are not as close and a lot's been moving, and what this actually meant. So it was our intent is no one would get like a cold survey in their mailbox. As both myself and Alexander Cato from Office of Public Service, who's here in support today, I thank him for helping me, because we made it a goal to like everyone would get a one-on-one face-to-face meeting with staff. This was all direct. And as I said, this provided an opportunity to give all their feedback. Most of these meetings lasted an hour. So 15 of those property owners got direct FaceTime with us to talk about the project more broadly, and then fully understand like what is this and what isn't, what it isn't. And so they understood that, because we understand that like if you're being asked to conduct a survey and potentially sign related to your parcel number, you might have questions related to it. So we wanted to make sure we were really thoughtful of how we did this and get a high number of results in short order.
Okay, right, thank you. Just want to say that, and I'm sure they didn't have another checkbox where it says, or have you recorded what they prefer the plan to be, other than A and B, or?
Chair Cashman, Councilmember Osmond, yes, the goal was to get the sign off, and other than the one residential property, I've been able to get all the signatures. One, I've been having a text message back and forth of trying to find a time in South Minneapolis so we can cross paths and sign off, but I've gotten formal signatures of a majority of the respondents. Not like a verbal, or maybe it is like all in-person signatures that reflected the meetings and the conversations we've had. So it isn't if I wanted to make sure we could walk in and have a thorough conversation where I could say, I got a signature, or I need to find them find them somewhere and get them to sign. But a majority have been hard signatures in response to the survey.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the other staff for making that happen in a very short time. My comment is that, this is a historic site, a symbol of freedom and a worldwide phenomenon, movement that happened. And I think that it will take us a decision to make sure that this is something that we are preserving, so generations from now realize that what happened here doesn't happen again. So. Thank you, Councilmember Cashman.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember. And next I'll recognize Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Chair Cashman, and thanks for the presentation, Nathan. Can you explain the signature component part a little bit more? Why are we taking signatures, and what is that for?
Yeah, Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chavez, when we were developing the survey, one of the components is making sure we had transparency and accountability. So when we as staff come up here, it isn't, well, we heard, via text or someone. We wanted to make sure like it was like something that we could point to say, yes, we don't vouch for us. It is, we have something physical that shows that we had the meeting and that we followed through on that. And in the survey, I believe we have distributed to some council members. I might have to have Tim chime in, but we crafted it in a way that it was very clear that this was just a preliminary information gathering survey, and that's why there was that more personal touch. So like people had some level of confidence of what this did represent or not, and they weren't either misunderstanding or scared away from participating. And just, as we talk a lot about engagement and trust building as staff through complicated projects, we wanted to remove as many barriers as possible for people to feel like they could participate, and that would reflect our approach on all projects as employees.
For sure. Thank you. And that was my understanding at first. I just wanted to make sure that that was still the case, that it wasn't looking for signatures and then this process is done through the official channels of going through the pedestrian ordinance model that we would have to go towards. So I just want to confirm that publicly. I think the only comment I'll say here is that as someone that actually represents the area, the conversations right now about Nicollet Mall being turned into pedestrian mall, or, you know, getting buses off Nicollet, the conversation hasn't been, do you want buses off Nicollet? It's mostly been, buses are coming off Nicollet, whether you like it or not. And here's engagement. And, you know, that is a hard pill to swallow for many of my residents, where having a pedestrian conversation has been combative in the city enterprise, but somehow downtown Minneapolis, it's, let's do it. Let's bring downtown back. Let's get buses off Nicollet for folks. And I just wanted to make that comment very loud and clear today, that is very frustrating, especially in a diverse area of like South Minneapolis. And I wanted to make sure that I communicated that to my residents. And based on this presentation, I think I also want to make sure my residents don't get confused, because they're probably watching this at home. The open concept is not a pedestrian mall. Whether there is some potential barriers or potential gate locations that could come, that's not a pedestrian mall. And I don't want my constituents to think that that is a pedestrian mall, and the presentation today could be confusing to some of them with the particularly raised intersection of the open concept. And I want to be clear with my constituents, that is not a pedestrian mall. And to say that we would want to do an open concept and maybe 20 years down the road have a pedestrian mall, no, my community wants guarantees. They don't want false promises or insinuations that this would be a pedestrian mall eventually. And I just want to make it clear that the open concept is an open concept. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Chavez. Next, I'll recognize Councilmember Chowdhury.
Thank you, Chair Cashman. Thank you, Mr. Costner, for your presentation. I have a series of different questions, and I want to say that the questions that I have is no way a reflection of me not appreciating the work that staff's done or disparaging it. I really, really appreciate all the time and effort you've taken. I know it's taken a lot of time, especially coming into the new year, but it is more a reflection of kind of what I've been wrestling with. I haven't spoken much on this myself, and just some confusion that I'm feeling and seeing within this process as we discuss these options. The first thing, Councilmember Cashman may have asked this, but I wanted to ask a little bit more directly just to clarify. The flexible open option, since it has gates that close, would that have required, or does that require a pedestrian mall survey?
Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chowdhury, I would probably seek a little bit of input here from Tiffany, if she would want to jump in.
Thank you, Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chowdhury. Yes, if a gate is closed at any regular interval, whether it's every Saturday, whether it's once a month from 9 to 5, any regular interval that would close the area off to pedestrian or to traffic and make it pedestrian only would trigger the pedestrian statute.
Thank you, and this might be for you, Attorney Spoor. Within the state statute for a pedestrian mall, does the city have to articulate when those closures would be?
Thank you, Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chowdhury. Yes, the state statute requires us to specifically put in our ordinance that would be creating what times and spaces and dates that a pedestrian mall would be active or a street would be closed.
Thank you. I want to note that this is a huge point of confusion that has just gotten some clarification, and I'm glad that we took the time of not rushing through the process for this, because the concept that we were planning on voting on, or was before us, option C, was a flexible open, but at that time, we did not know that we would have to do a pedestrian mall ordinance. And that's coming to light now for this. The confusion that I have with this like flexible close and open, whether it's the raised intersection or the flexible open, is how do we articulate that to the state, how do we, if businesses for the larger block are already 100% in disagreement, how is that an option? And then the place where I see even more a lack of like realistic feasibility is how would our community even apply to do a closed situation? How would we permit for that? Would we have to permit for that? And then also, we're talking about transit and bus rapid transit going through here. How would we create a calendar with Metro Transit to determine the days where the whole block would be closed off? And how would that not be a major disruption to transit service for individuals that rely on the D line? And these are some of the questions that I have for you if you've considered for this flexible open or the raised intersection. How would we work with community to close it off? And how would we work with Metro Transit so it didn't disrupt transit service?
Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chowdhury, I can answer one part of your question first. Is as a part of the survey process, one of the intents of having that conversation is we could have a little bit more nuance of what the project is. And what I can clarify is the aspect of recurring but not full-time closures was something that there was support for, but without having a clear definition of like what that regular recurrence would be, or down the like when an ordinance would be established if it was for PedMall. Like that's what we wanted to make sure that there was a conversation open for, not an all or nothing. So I would say the nuance of that conversation, it was that if there was something set up more regularly but not permanent, there was more openness to that other than as compared to just a hard full closure. I believe there's maybe some other questions in there related to how we partner with our agencies and Metro Transit and business owners. I think until we define with the community like what success of like recurring closures would be, it would be hard to say like what those impacts of those closures would be for communication, working with emergency response. So those are things that we would be committed to working to figure out. If there's anything else, Tiffany, in there that I may have missed, I would ask if you jump in.
Director Sexton also wants to weigh in too.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Cashman. And I just wanted to address 2 points that have come up recently. The first, this is the flexible option. I just wanted to clarify, and the pedestrian plaza would look likely functionally the same. It's a matter of how often that gate would be raised. There's, especially given the tragedy in New Orleans and other instances, it would not be an unimpeded, there would be some sort of delineation or break between the street and that pedestrian area. And there would need to be continued access for loading, for emergency vehicles and other sort of essential services. So we're basically talking about how often that gate is raised and what the requirements or that burden might be to raising that gate in the simplest terms. The other piece here is that the flexible option reflects our commitment to recognizing this is a different place. And so we know that burden to making this accessible, to closing that gate when there's gatherings or other events, that would look different than it does in other places throughout the city. What exactly that is, we haven't determined because we don't have an approved layout just yet. But we are committed to making that space usable for these gatherings and having it easy to be closed. That's a commitment that we've made, and that's reflected in the terminology that we've used and how we came to that recommendation. So there's 2 points I just want to be very clear about, that we're talking about very limited differences in terms of what that looks like out there.
If I might just ask, sorry, go ahead.
I would like to keep going with my
You're
time. Thank you. I, with all of the respect in the world, I understand this commitment that our department is making, and I think that a commitment to our community is something that is a shared goal for us. I think the part where I will disagree is the fact that we need a concept plan in order for us to understand how this would be feasible for the community, because we can't make a commitment that they would have a place to gather and do this when these feasibility questions aren't answered. And again, respectfully, when we were talking about option C, the question of needing to make a pedestrian mall ordinance was not even brought up to us, and that would be something that we as a body would have needed to conduct. And that makes me weary, and I don't feel like with a flexible open, we have looked into enough for, as a council member, I'll speak for myself, as a policymaker, to say this is the design that I feel confidently going in. And one of the reasons I'll name is I don't know if community members and George Floyd Square would need to get a permit through the city in order to hold an event. And if they needed a permit, I don't know if that feels right to me, that they would have to go through a bureaucratic effort, that they would potentially have to pay a fee in order to do activities that they have already been doing. And this question about transit access was a huge point when we were thinking about the layouts. And now we don't have an answered question of how that would work with bus rapid transit if we had flexible. And one thing that I really want to highlight in my time in speaking is I'm really grateful to be in this committee. I really enjoy when we take up different concept plans and layouts and street improvement. However, this issue, George Floyd Square, I've heard people say George Floyd Square is a street improvement issue that we're discussing. It is not a street improvement issue. It is a whole ecosystem and community layout. And we have to think about the history here of how the city has shown up in this space. Obviously, the murder of George Floyd, but then the reopening of George Floyd Square that happened in the middle of the night at 4 a.m. by our own city staff that traumatized the community. And we don't have assurances that the community would have some autonomy here with a flexible open. One of the things that I have a concern about is what if the community decided, okay, this is too difficult for us to close up the space for us to do regular community events that we would do before or we want to do. So we're just going to close the gates ourselves. What would the city's recourse be then? Would it be to remove the gates outright because there isn't compliance? That gives me a pause because I don't want to see growing tension here. And I also think there's a compromise to be found as a body, and I think the idea of option A, where it's that partial cul-de-sac, is one that is worth considering and looking at feasibly for how we could do that. And I think this street improvement part is a part where there is division among council members. I have respect for that, but the things that I feel like we don't have division on, that we haven't adequately discussed or taken up, and that might not fall into public works, is public safety in this area. What do we need to do to make it safer over here? What's the strategic plan? Economic revitalization. We've known that the businesses here have struggled for a long time. We agree. What can we do to support that? Transit access. What connections can we make while Metro Transit isn't going through here, potentially won't be going through here in the future, to improve that? And the last thing I'll just close on, I've heard a lot of rhetoric of saying that this is a bad place or a dilapidated place, it's suffering. I want to just say to the community, that's not the only narrative about this place. This is a beloved place by many people throughout our city, where community members regularly have gatherings and meetings. A new coffee shop opened up where their workers are unionized. I had 2 constituents who got married at George Floyd Square this last week. It's beloved. And there are good things happened here. And it's not just this tattered image of a place that is dying out. No, despite the actions of the city, community members are coming together and bringing life here. And here's an opportunity for us to really feel clear about what this means for the community and figure out what we're doing. And at this point, we don't have a concept plan where I'll again say as a council member that I feel confident in voting for.
Thank you, council member. I did get back in queue, following up on some things that you said, Director Sexton, that there's, not many design differences between the Ped Mall and Flexible Open. And I think, first seeing that, I can understand what you mean, but I also am seeing like 2 BRT stations here on Chicago. That seems like a pretty expensive difference. And then also the cul-de-sac part is different between those 2 options. So I just want to understand like how, a BRT station is no small lift to install. Like what is the difference between those options in terms of time and cost of those elements that are clearly different?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Cashman. If it's okay, I'll have Nathan start this off.
Chair Cashman, that's a really good question, highlighting our partnership with Metro Transit. This is something they already had budgeted for as a part of their D-line, and with us being able to generally design the layout, we would put in curb, gutter, street to match what they need to do, and then they would bring in their funding and put the finishing touches on. So it would not have an impact in any meaningful way on our street project as it relates to the BRT. However, on the flip side, if we were to remain on long-term detour and that was permanentized, there is the question of additional city investments that have to be made on other streets to be able to accommodate those buses long-term that are city streets. So like that is still an open question of like how the city would have to pay for additional investments for those detoured streets, specifically 39th, which was never designed to be a bus route. And then I believe you had a second question, but I was...
The cul-de-sac element is also very clearly different between the 2 options. So what's the cost analysis and timeline analysis of those 2?
Great question, again, Chair Cashman. So one thing I was mentioning with this is a concept layout. So until we get a approved layout, we're not able to like take it down to the dollars and cents. But what Director Sexton was alluding to is that as we look at the space for like needs for emergency access, and as we continue to work with our internal partners, Director Sexton had mentioned there is a need to have access for whether it's fire, emergency vehicles, to have a space where potentially you would have to have a mountable space. And as our fire code indicates, 20 feet of clear. So a 20-foot space would likely have to be reserved where there would be no vertical elements where vehicles would have to get through. So when you look at the difference that we're trying to illustrate on the screen, where the raised intersection is called out, where there's that space that would be flat, potentially raised if we get to that point of engineering, that would have to be unobstructed. Similarly, the pedestrian plaza would also have potential mounted space that would also have approximately 20 feet of space where there would be no vertical obstructions. And that's kind of trying to verbalize what the point of being of like, it could look very, very similar in design. And I'll let Director Sexton jump in if I missed anything.
Nothing to add. I think Nathan captured it very accurately.
Okay, and then I heard you say that there was support for recurring closure of the street, or there was more support for that during community engagement, and I think that's really positive to hear. And because I definitely support that, like a frequent occurrence of open streets at this space. Open streets meaning streets closed to cars, and it's very confusing to differentiate those things, but that's what I mean by open streets, is the open streets events that we put on when we block off car and bus access to make room for pedestrians. But my question here is, when you did this survey to property owners about whether they support pedestrian plaza, why didn't you ask them if they would support a regular cadence of street closure?
That's a great question, Councilmember Cashman. So we were trying to be responsive to was the resolution that got brought forward. But as I stated, having an open conversation and trying to ask and be open about what other things could or couldn't work, that is why we were very intentional on those one-on-one conversations to have a more nuanced conversation of like, what do you feel about like it? Well, is it all or nothing? Is it hard closure? Or what if there was regular events? And trying to figure out what those spaces were, so then we as staff could take that information in, but also be able to share it back to like figure out like how and where do we take this. But we did have to draw the line on this preliminary survey at some point, so it wasn't endlessly open-ended. And that was the best place we had, given the information from council and internally of how we'd want to move it forward and be responsive and accountable to what was presented to us.
Okay, I just think that probably we wouldn't have had 100% no if the question would have been, would you, be open to a regular cadence of events? likely there would be less no's, right?
Chair Cashman, and this is why I think I'd responded to Councilmember Chavez of like, if I'm gonna speak to numbers, I would rather have it signed, but I would say the conversations were much more open and positive to that description of like regular frequent closures as compared to like permanent full-time.
Okay.
And I think that's why having a good conversation keeps the door open and why we didn't want to be perceived as like, hey, this is all negative. It is very much like if this wants to be an option, we have to be positive and we have to be able to articulate our needs, desires of like what those options are in the future, which is why we approached it in that manner.
Okay, I'm going to recognize Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Chair Cashman. And I got back on cue because, I want to clarify to the public, because I think if they're watching this, they're going to get utterly confused that somehow the open concept is literally almost the same as a pedestrian concept. It's not. Look at the photos. The draft concepts are clearly very different. And I don't want any insinuation of the public getting confused from that. So I want to make that very clear. But not only are they completely different in the draft concept layout, there is a key difference here. In the summer of 2020, the Minneapolis Police Department murdered George Floyd, and it literally broke the trust of Minneapolis residents with the Minneapolis Police Department. The trust. Trust was broken by many residents. I'm not going to say all, but many. And I'll speak for my residents in Ward 9. There was a trust between many of my residents and the Minneapolis Police Department. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because we're talking about approving a concept layout and then hoping that you will trust your city government that eventually, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, maybe 5 years down the road, they will create a pedestrian mall for you. They're asking the same government that murdered George Floyd to trust you, to trust the city enterprise that they're going to build a pedestrian mall 5 years, 10 years down the road. That's not happening. I'm sorry. to have my constituents trust that that's going to happen years down the road, I do not trust that. I myself don't even trust that. So what I'm saying is there's a clear difference here. There is an opportunity to move forward with the pedestrian concept, guaranteeing that that's what we're going to do by passing a concept layout plan at the same time as passing an ordinance. That is a process. And then the other route that we're talking about is potentially passing an ordinance after construction, after this is all done, and then hoping that it happens. The clear difference isn't just the draft concept plan, it is the trust between government and its citizens. And that's what I want to highlight here. That is a big difference. Trust has been broken with many of our constituents, and the route we decide to go towards, that is a key difference, and it's trust, trust, trust. So I just want to make that very loud and clear today, that that is not a small thing. Trust needs to be earned, and trust has not been earned by many of our residents. Thank you.
Next, I'll recognize Councilmember Chowdhury.
Thank you, Chair Cashman. I had a couple questions that came to mind, again, about the pedestrian mall ordinance, and this is probably for City Attorney Spoor. In order for a pedestrian mall to be allowed, there's obviously the survey. What percentage of businesses or owners of frontage need to support in order for that to be enacted by the city?
Thank you, Chair Cashman and Councilmember Chowdhury. It's a little bit more complicated than that, so I'm going to try to break it down.
Please.
So the pedestrian mall statute gives property owners that are adjacent to the property, so that are abutting the pedestrian mall area, which means kind of right next to it, the ability to provide a protest. So essentially to write a written objection to the pedestrian mall. So if property owners representing over 50% of the frontage say write in a written objection, then the city cannot go forward with the pedestrian mall. So that means, sorry.
I was just gonna say if you could define frontage for those who might not know what that is.
Frontage means that's the property that is abutting or next to the pedestrian mall, so surrounding the pedestrian mall. So for example, you could have a property owner that owned 51% of the abutting frontage because their property is very large. They would have, in that case, they could be the only one who objects, and it would still be, the city would still not be able to go forward. You could also have a property owners representing 50.001% of that area, and it still would not be able to go forward. So it's just, as long as it's a majority of the property owners, therefore property owners representing a majority of the frontage, then it can't go forward.
Thank you. And this might be a question now for Mr. Costner. Just looking at option B, obviously, there's a majority there that is in protest just based off of preliminary conversations. But looking at option A, do you have an understanding of how much of the frontage the property owners at the, I believe, 2 local businesses have in that section?
Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chowdhury, as I mentioned, these are preliminary concepts, so like without the final engineering, we're unclear if like the design may force the cul-de-sac to be a little bit to the north, a little bit to the south. So to get exact numbers without all the detailed design, we're unsure if there could be utility conflicts or how it would actually work once we got into detailed design to give like an exact number. Because if you look at the, I'm going to move forward to this slide, as you can see, the way the parcels line up, it does become very close because of the presence of the alley in the public right-of-way there. And the way the cul-de-sac comes in is we need to preserve access to the public alley for trash pickup, what have you. But until we get a final design, it's really hard to say exactly how the math works up of frontage.
Yes.
Chair, and Councilmember, if I may add, I think though Nathan's exactly right. It's the designs that we did initially we did not design them with any awareness of the Boulevard Ordinance. But if you look at even the graphics there, as Nathan mentioned, it's really hard to understand exactly where those boundaries would be because of, once we get into final design, understanding, say, that cul-de-sac, what would be considered within that cul-de-sac even as frontage. If it's possible that that cul-de-sac would need to be raised, 20 feet or 50 feet to the north, it's possible it could come back. I will say, though, just looking at this, it's more likely that the cul-de-sac would extend north up into the alley or beyond than it is that it would come south of that. So it's likely that all the properties that Nathan showed on the other slide, that multiple property owners would have a say in the final outcome of this if it did go to, the statutory voting process.
And Chair Cashman, Councilmember Chowdhury, and the one thing I want to clarify, the Director Sexton said, the reason why it wouldn't go south is because of the preservation of memorial space and the priorities that has been very clearly articulated to Public Works that we would not go south to further impact the amount of space that could be designated for what the community has been using for, approaching 5 years now. So that's the reason why that would be an option to go further south.
Okay. And I'll just note and say one of the pieces that I think is important to note here is that the city owns a part of the frontage at the People's Way, and I think that's a part of the consideration too for us to think about a compromise we can move towards. And so I'm interested in option A and exploring that. I'll just speak for myself, but I also want to. You made me think of this when you said preserving memorial space. The place in which George Floyd was murdered is memorial space, absolutely. And I also believe the street that was needed to be crossed by the bystanders who came and called and asked for officers to get off of George Floyd's neck, that crossing that needed to happen from the People's Way, that brought people together all around the block, that is also memorial space. And I highly encourage our Public Works Department to consider that. And I think that is a part of the heartache and heartburn among community members who want to see a pedestrian mall in this area. It is not only the place in which George Floyd died. It is everything that occurred in that area. Chair, with that, I've concluded my comments.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, I'll recognize Councilmember Vita.
Thank you, Chair. We've been listening to these presentations, and I guess I'm just like really growing confused about the people in this community have said that, the people who are going to be most impacted by this have said that they don't want the pedestrian mall concept layout. I mean, do we think we know better than these people? They've asked for it. They've said they want it. They've told us over and over again. Why aren't we listening to them? If you look at the meeting back in December, I think it was, like everything that was presented to us says that. There's an outside vendor who, their report said the same thing, that, full vehicle access, that people were strongly opposed to restricted access. So I'm just not understanding what is, where this is where we divided at on this when this information was presented to us. And it's so hypocritical to have information presented to you and then to say that we should be doing the opposite of what, after years of engagement, we should be doing the opposite. And I also want to speak to the comments around trust. 100% people don't trust government, people don't trust council members, people don't trust a lot of things. But I signed up to be a council member because I want to bridge that gap of trust. I don't want to keep going into my community and saying, you don't trust government. I want to be the person that makes sure at some point that somebody in my career as an elected official, I want to make sure that somebody is trusting government. I know I'm not going to fix every relationship with people in North Minneapolis and the city of Minneapolis, but I'm also not going to be creating a narrative where it's not possible. When there's an opportunity to bridge government and residents, I want to do that, and this is an opportunity. People have spoke up. People are looking for leadership on this. People are looking for us to make the hard decision of moving forward on this. And we just keep getting to this place of doing nothing or not engaging around what's been brought before us because we don't like what people are saying they want. And it's not okay. I started out my comments earlier thanking staff because I understand how much work has been put into this. And I understand that there was possibly some people who didn't trust staff, but the way you approach people, it changed that. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. If somebody from the city of Minneapolis knocks on my door and asks me how I feel about a concept plan, guess what that's doing? Building trust. I may not fully trust you, but I appreciate that you knocked on my door. I appreciate that you gave me an opportunity to speak because that probably didn't happen 4 years ago. And because of the situation we're in, and staff know that, and staff know that they'll be the first ones professionally and in some cases personally attacked by these very big controversial decisions, that it's important that when staff does the work of engaging community in a way that's not the status quo, we have to really highlight that and acknowledge that, nope, we're not all the way there, but are we getting there? Probably. Is this gonna be the one issue that gets us there? Probably not, but we have this issue to say we're trying. I, as a council member, ran for office because I wanted to bridge the gap. I can use an example. Public Works was hard for me to access as a resident of Minneapolis. When I talked to residents in Ward 4, I understood that this department is imperative for the community that I represent. Public Works it encompasses so much around livability in this city, and it was important for me to build relationships within Public Works, and then take those relationships back to Ward 4 and say, when somebody says, well, Public Works doesn't do this, it's not okay for me to say, they don't. They didn't do it for me either. It's for me to say, you know what, we're gonna work on it, or I worked on it. They didn't do that. To correct people when they say that city staff did something that's not true, and to keep working on it. I don't have ego when it comes to my residents. Zero ego for me. I will work with anybody. I thank people. I say no thank you. Whatever I need to do to make sure Ward 4 gets what they have coming to them and what they deserve or what they want. Not what I want or how I want. I can sit in the room with anybody on behalf of my residents. And I know what staff is doing here. I know you all are doing hard work to make sure that this project is the best that it can be. And so, like, no, everybody doesn't trust you, but I know you're working very hard to build trust with community. I know you're working very hard to build trust with council members. And it's not okay to keep creating a division when people are working hard on progress. I want every staff person who has worked on this to go away feeling like you have done something. It's not bad. It's good. You're presenting to us options. It's up to us to make the hard decisions. And go back to community and say, nope, it may not be where we want it to be, but trust that as your council member, I'm gonna see it through. And make sure that people behind you see it through also. That's our responsibility as elected officials. You shouldn't have to take on the responsibility that we signed up for as elected officials and continue to create a division between us and what constituents say or what other people say about a particular area or whatever. It's not okay, and I don't want any staff member to take any responsibility for that, in particular on this, because I know you're doing a damn good job at seeing this through and making sure that we get the best of what people asked for.
Thank you, Councilmember. So seeing no further discussion on this item, I'm going to motion to continue it another cycle to February 6th. On that motion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Ayes have it. This item is continued. So with that, we've concluded all business to come before the committee, and without objection, we stand adjourned.